Unauthorized migrants who risk their lives and their freedom crossing the border from Mexico to the U.S. Immigration reform is more than just a political debate. Too often, it's a tragic personal story of separation, imprisonment, and loss. My guest today, Assistant Professor of Sociology, Daniel Martínez, has taken a sobering look at the human face of immigration. His research casts a spotlight on the plight of unauthorized migrants and the often staggering impact of border crossings on their own lives and their families. Dan, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure.
Now, you've conducted interviews with hundreds of migrants. What is it about their story that you think is being eclipsed by the current political debate?
I think this is a great question. First and foremost, we need to keep in mind that when people migrate, they tend to migrate due to factors that are largely beyond their individual control. For instance, people tend to be pushed from their home countries due to poverty or unemployment, while at the same time being pulled to the United States or to a destination country due to factors such as not only the demand for cheap labor, but the demand for cheap immigrant labor per se. I also think we need to keep in mind some of the unintended consequences of increased border enforcement efforts. For instance, we've seen an increase in migrant deaths in places like southern Arizona and South Texas over the last 10-15 years. Border enforcement efforts, when coupled with a strong desire to come to this country, as well as inadequate legal channels to do so, create opportunities or a boon for human smugglers or other people operating in the informal economy near the border.
Well, one of the things that's really interesting and that you talked about just a moment ago are the deaths. Mm-hmm. What risks do migrants face when they cross the border? Can you talk more about this?
Absolutely. Now, immigrants, when they cross the border, they face risk beyond just being apprehended by U.S. authorities, right? They face the risk of victimization by drug gangs near the border, by human smugglers, by rival coyotes or human smugglers from other groups. By even in some cases, we know that they face risk of mistreatment or abuse by agents of the state, for instance, in Mexico or in the United States itself. However, the single most important risk or most devastating risk that immigrants face is death. We know that border enforcement efforts have redirected migrant flows away from traditional crossing points along the border, for instance, like Tijuana, San Diego, or El Paso, Texas, and Juarez, Chihuahua, into areas of southern Arizona and South Texas, right? So now people are being forced to cross for longer periods of time in more remote areas in order to avoid detection by U.S. authorities. And so we've seen, for instance, just in southern Arizona alone, we've seen over 2,300 people have attempted to cross the border and have died. Some of the work that I've done, we've seen that roughly 10% of all people who are crossing the border report seeing human remains along the way. Just devastating. So if people do survive the journey, they oftentimes will have to deal with psychological and physiological effects that will stay with them for the rest of their lives.
Well, this is really interesting. I'd love to return to a point when you're talking about Central America in particular, this long migration from Central America, parts of Central America, into the United States. Can you talk to us about kind of the other types of experiences and violence that may exist in that route, specifically relating to gang violence and drug cartels?
We know oftentimes the general public thinks of unauthorized migrants as this homogenous group, right? That's not the case. We know that the experiences of unauthorized migrants from Mexico crossing the United States are substantially different than the experiences of Central Americans who oftentimes are forced to traverse multiple international borders, perhaps ride the train, what they call la bestia, or the beast, up to the border and then try to cross the U.S.-Mexico border. So in the past, until very recent, immigrants from Central America would board the train in southern Mexico, for instance, in the state of Chiapas, and they would ride the train, these freight trains, all the way up to Mexico City and ultimately to the border with South Texas. Along the way, they would be at risk for encountering MS-13 or other gangs who would extort them, and if they're unable to pay, would throw them from the train. So there's some pretty horrible accounts of migrants being victimized on the trains, as well as, for instance, women being sexually assaulted, people being, again, tossed off the trains if they're unable to pay.
One of the things that happens here in Washington, of course, is that we often forget that such debates, policy debates, really affect communities and families. And I was just wondering, in the course of doing your interviews, what did you hear?
We often forget that immigrants are ordinary people, right? They're not just simply criminals who cross the border. They are members of our communities. They go to school with our children. They work with us. They're our friends, and many times they're part of our families, right? So what we see, one of the important factors that I really want to shed some light on is this idea of family separation, right? Oftentimes we think of unauthorized immigrants and their families being marginalized, being this other group in the shadows. The reality is they're parts of our community and they're interwoven into our communities. We know that hundreds of thousands of kids, U.S.-born, U.S. citizen children, have experienced family separation, having their mothers or their fathers being taken away from their lives. And you know, this is something that is a serious concern to me. I tend to have one foot in immigration research, but I also have one foot in research in criminology and juvenile delinquency. And we know that one important risk factor that youth can experience in their lives that can lead them down to that road and to delinquency is family dissolution, right? The family separation. So that's a serious concern.
I'd like to take that and then now return to policy questions for a minute. Our current debate has focused so much on law enforcement rather than on social factors and social questions. With President Obama's recent immigration reform policy initiatives, how do you see the philosophy changing, if at all, based on some of these social determinants?
I think this is a really important question. I want to just preface by saying that our approach to immigration control has mirrored our approach to crime control in the United States. So our approach to crime control in the United States has really shifted from penal welfarism and this rehabilitative ideal to more of a punitive approach to crime control. We see the exact same thing happening with immigration enforcement. In the past, crossing the border, unauthorized entry was largely a civil administrative matter. Today it's a criminal matter. Today it's for unauthorized entry you can get charged with a misdemeanor. For unauthorized re-entry you can actually get charged for an aggravated felony, right? I think that main overarching approach to handling social problems and dealing with social problems, whether it's crime, whether it's immigration, that's something that I don't necessarily see. I don't see that ideology shifting anytime soon. But I do think that we are seeing some unintended consequences of this immigration enforcement, namely via the criminal justice system. There's some unintended consequences there. For instance, as I mentioned, unauthorized re-entry into the country is now an aggravated felony. And an aggravated felony would bar you from being covered, for instance, through the deferred action for parents, President Obama's most recent executive order. So there is this disconnect. Yes, I think this is a step in the right direction. I do think that some of these policies are going to keep hundreds of thousands of people, millions of people from being formally deported. I think the latest estimate is about 6 million people. However, there are roughly another 5 million people that are going to be completely excluded because, for instance, they might have a formal deportation on their record that excludes them from being able to be part of this program.
Professor Martínez, thank you so much for really sharing some incredibly important information and for illuminating one of the critical questions on the social policy scheme today.
It's a pleasure to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.